The world remembers 1936 for political storms, rising dictators, collapsing empires, and the final tremors before a global war. But hidden beneath all that noise was a quieter battle, one fought not with armies, but with currencies. A secret pact, whispered between Washington, London, and Paris, that would quietly rewrite the balance of global power. And if you care about how money really works, subscribe now, because this story reveals the blueprint behind the financial world you live in today. Most people think global finance is built on laws, institutions, and agreements written in grand halls. But that's the illusion. The real architecture is built in back rooms, between a handful of men who understand that whoever controls the currency controls the world. In the mid-1930s, the world was in chaos. The gold standard had collapsed. Nations were devaluing their currencies in a desperate race to survive the Great Depression. There was no trust, no rules, no stability. Money itself had become unmoored, a weapon, not a tool. And that's when the United States, Britain, and France did something extraordinary. Without treaties, signatures, or public statements, they formed a quiet alliance to stop the bleeding. A gentleman's agreement. A handshake written in silence. Not democracy, not transparency. Just elite coordination at the moment the world needed it most, or feared it most. The story begins with the death of the gold standard. It didn't collapse overnight. It crumbled, slowly, like stone weathered into dust. Britain fell first in 1931, abandoning gold after a speculative attack drained its reserves. The pound, once the symbol of imperial confidence, became a floating orphan, drifting wherever the markets pushed it. The United States followed soon after. FDR's decision to confiscate gold from citizens and devalue the dollar was not an act of reform. It was a financial coup dressed as patriotism. France held on to gold the longest, trying to preserve a world that no longer existed, clinging to stability in a time when stability had become a myth. By 1936, the global monetary system was a battlefield. Currencies collapsed, recovered, collapsed again. Nations attacked each other through devaluation, each hoping to boost exports at the expense of its neighbors. It was economic trench warfare, the kind that doesn't spill blood immediately, but destroys economies silently and slowly. Trade froze. Investment died. Factories shut down not because people didn't need goods, but because no one could agree on what money was worth. It was in this moment of uncertainty that three governments reached for the same unspoken conclusion. If they didn't stop the currency war, the world would slide into deeper depression or into something far worse. But the way they stopped it, that's the part history books barely whisper about. It wasn't a treaty. It wasn't a conference. It wasn't even announced. It was a pact built on secrecy, a coordinated, behind-closed-doors agreement between the three central banking powers that mattered most: the United States Treasury, the Bank of England, and the Banque de France. Each agreed to quietly intervene in the foreign exchange markets, not to fix prices like the old gold standard, but to gently stabilize them. A soft touch instead of an iron cage. A new philosophy. Currencies would no longer be servants of gold, but tools for governments to manage as they pleased. This was the turning point. The moment the world shifted from metal-backed money to trust-backed money, and from trust-backed money to power-backed money. And the strange part? Nobody knew it was happening. Markets calmed. Gold outflows slowed. Trade flickered back to life. And yet, not a single voter had any idea that a new monetary order had been born, one built on cooperation, manipulation, and quiet coordination instead of rules. But stability bought through secrecy is never stable for long. The strange thing about 1936 is that almost no one alive at the time understood what had just happened. There were no press conferences, no radio addresses, no triumphant signatures flashed across newspapers. The world was drowning in economic chaos, currencies collapsing one after another. And yet the single most important monetary maneuver of the decade unfolded quietly, almost whispered, between three governments desperately trying to keep their nations from falling apart. The United States was still staggering under the weight of the Great Depression. Britain was exhausted after abandoning the gold standard in 1931, and France, proud but cornered, had clung to gold longer than anyone, only to see its reserves drain like a sinking ship taking water. Each country was fighting its own demons, yet all three faced the same impossible enemy: a global financial system spiraling out of control. Markets were in free fall, trade had collapsed, and every nation's instinct was the same: devalue the currency, boost exports, survive another month. But every devaluation triggered retaliation, and every retaliation tore another piece out of the world economy. It was currency warfare disguised as national policy, and the world was bleeding from 1,000 invisible cuts. What most people didn't know was that behind the scenes, Washington, London, and Paris were terrified. Terrified not just of economic collapse, but of political revolution. The Great Depression was already feeding extremist movements from Europe to Asia. Fascism was rising. Communism was spreading. Democracies were cracking under pressure. And all of it, every protest, every riot, every new authoritarian voice, traced back to the same root cause: money no longer worked. And when money fails, obedience fails with it. So in the late summer of 1936, 3 delegations quietly boarded ships, trains, and unmarked cars. No parades, no press. Just silent men in worn coats carrying leather briefcases filled with economic reports, gold flow charts, and instructions handwritten by presidents and prime ministers. They met not in parliament halls, but in shadowed back rooms. The kind where curtains stay drawn even at noon, where cigarette smoke hangs thick as fog, and where decisions are made not for months ahead, but for decades. In those rooms, surrounded by outdated maps and the faint ticking of clocks, the representatives of the US, UK, and France began rewriting the rules of global money. Not with treaties or signatures, not with legal frameworks, but with something far more powerful: a promise, a gentleman's agreement, a whispered pact, a coordinated decision to quietly move the world away from gold and into something far more flexible, far more political, far more dangerous. You see, the gold standard had been the foundation of the world economy for centuries, an anchor, a guarantee, a chain of discipline on governments who would otherwise spend, borrow, and print their nations into ruin. But by 1936, the gold standard had become a coffin. It offered stability, yes, but at the cost of suffocating national economies, forcing wage cuts, triggering deflation, and turning recessions into depressions. Breaking from gold meant survival, but breaking too loudly meant panic. So they agreed to act together. America would stop attacking sterling. Britain would stop undercutting the franc. France would stop hoarding gold. All 3 would intervene quietly in the currency markets, supporting each other's exchange rates, adjusting interest rates in harmony, and maintaining a delicate illusion of stability. For the first time in history, major world powers were coordinating monetary policy, not with gold, but with trust. And that was the true revolution. But trust on paper is not trust in practice. Behind every handshake was suspicion. Behind every promise was fear of betrayal. And behind every official communique was a second, secret version, the one that described what would happen if the pact broke. Because they all knew the truth. If one nation cheated, the entire global system would crack open. And someone, somewhere, was already planning to cheat. The strange thing about the Tripartite Agreement is that no one, not the newspapers, not the public, not even most politicians, understood what had really happened. On the surface, it sounded harmless. 3 nations agreeing not to destroy each other as currencies in the middle of a global depression. A polite handshake between gentlemen in neatly pressed suits. But beneath that politeness was a completely different story, a story of fear. Because by 1936, money itself had become a battlefield. Every major economy on Earth was scrambling for survival. Unemployment was everywhere. Banks had collapsed. Governments were defaulting. And currencies, once symbols of confidence, were now weapons. Nations were devaluing on purpose to make exports cheaper, undercut trade rivals, and steal whatever economic oxygen they could find. It was financial trench warfare, invisible but brutal. The world had already watched the gold standard collapse like a dying star. Britain abandoned gold first in 1931, setting off shockwaves across Europe. The United States followed in 1933, when Roosevelt stunned the world by taking America off gold domestically and revaluing the dollar. France held on the longest, clinging to the illusion of stability, but even the French franc began to bleed. Money had lost its anchor. Trust was evaporating. And behind closed doors, central bankers knew the truth. If the downward spiral continued, if each nation kept undercutting the next, global trade would die completely. And without trade, democracies would collapse one by one, leaving room only for authoritarian regimes promising order. That fear drove the Americans, the British, and the French into a quiet, uncomfortable marriage. But the negotiations were not smooth. They were tense, guarded, and filled with suspicion. The Americans believed Britain was manipulating markets. The British believed the French were hoarding gold to increase leverage. The French believed everyone was conspiring against them. Yet none of them had a choice. They were shackled together by a global system drifting toward chaos. So in the late summer of 1936, three delegations met privately, not in a grand ballroom, but in plain rooms behind embassy walls. Room temperature high, with cigarette smoke documents scattered across polished wooden tables, shadows cast by dim lamp silence, broken only when one central banker cleared his throat. Each man knew that the world beyond those walls had no idea what was happening, and that secrecy was the point. What they crafted was not a treaty, not a law, not even a formal agreement. It was a promise, a mutual vow. We will not destroy each other's currencies. We will not weaponize devaluation. We will quietly coordinate. It sounds modest, almost insignificant, but at that moment in history, it was revolutionary. For the first time, major powers agreed that money wasn't just a commodity, it was a tool of diplomacy, a geopolitical instrument, a lever of influence. And whoever controlled the levers of money would control the future. This pact, simple, fragile, marked the world's first experiment in coordinated monetary policy, not through gold, but through trust. But here's the twist almost no one talks about. That trust was uneven from the start. Because in every whispered negotiation, in every exchange of letters and cables, one currency kept emerging as the centerpiece of the pact. The currency they all needed to stabilize. The currency they all knew would rise if given the slightest opening. The US dollar. And this was the quiet moment the world shifted without realizing it. Because long before Bretton Woods, long before Nixon untethered the dollar from gold, long before the petrodollar and global reserves, the Tripartite Agreement crowned the U.S. dollar as the axis around which the financial world would spin. Not loudly, not officially, not in any headline, but silently, in the smoky rooms of diplomats and central bankers who understood that the Great Depression had rewritten the rules, and that America now held the strongest hand. And as the pact took shape, something else happened behind the scenes, something subtle but devastating. Gold stopped being the unquestioned ruler. Not legally, not yet, but psychologically. For centuries, gold had been the anchor of civilization's money. Now, gold was just another bargaining chip, another lever to be pulled when politics demanded it. The pact allowed countries to manage their currency values, code language for manipulation. The world had begun drifting into the age of fiat before the word even existed, and the public had no idea. And as the months rolled on, the agreement began to operate like a quiet heartbeat beneath the global economy. Steady, subtle, almost unheard unless you listened closely enough. Traders in New York and London noticed something strange. The wild, panicked currency swings that had defined the early 1930s suddenly softened. Exchange rates that had behaved like wounded animals were now strangely calm, like someone had slipped a hand over their muzzle and whispered, "Easy now." But the public never knew why. Newspapers carried hints, stabilization talks, international cooperation, phrases that meant nothing to the average citizen trying to claw their way out of the Depression. And that was intentional. Stability, the central banks believed, could only survive in silence. If people knew how fragile the system really was, they might test it, challenge it, or worse, lose faith altogether. Behind the facade of calm, however, the pact reshaped global power in ways no treaty or war had ever accomplished. The United States, with its booming gold reserves and industrial weight, began to pull the invisible levers. The dollar moved from being just another currency to an anchor, not by force, not by declaration, but by quiet necessity. Britain recognized it. France resented it. But both accepted the new gravitational center forming across the Atlantic. It wasn't a monarchy or a parliament that would lead the next century. It was a currency. The agreement became a rehearsal for a new world, one where money was guided not by metal, but by meetings behind closed doors. One where value could be nudged, steered, even molded by those who sat at the right tables. It was the beginning of a new era, the era of policy-driven money, of central banks as geopolitical weapons, of economics as statecraft. And yet, beneath this coordinated elegance, a contradiction lingered. A pact built to stop currency war was itself a weapon. A pact designed to restore trust depended entirely on secrecy. A pact created to stabilize the world quietly created new imbalances that would resurface decades later, stronger and more dangerous. But in 1936, none of that mattered. To the leaders who signed this invisible truce, survival came first. And survival meant bending the rules of money before money broke the rules of the world. What made the Tripartite Agreement so extraordinary wasn't its language or its signatures, it was the silence around it. No press conference, no public announcement, no triumphant speeches promising unity or cooperation. Instead, three of the world's most powerful nations simply stopped fighting each other in the currency markets. Quietly, casually, as if they knew that real economic power thrives in the shadows, not under spotlights. And in that silence, something began to shift. Foreign exchange desks from London to New York noticed it first. Volatility evaporated almost overnight. Traders who had spent months betting on chaotic devaluations suddenly found the floor beneath them turning solid again. It was as if invisible hands were holding the currencies in place, guiding them gently into alignment. But the real shift was happening far behind the scenes. In Washington, Treasury officials realized the United States now held leverage it had never possessed before. For the first time, other global powers were agreeing, not because they wanted to, but because they needed to stabilize around the dollar. It wasn't formal, it wasn't declared, but the gravitational pull was unmistakable. America had become the quiet anchor of a world that was still pretending to be tied to gold. In London, policymakers breathed a sigh of relief. After years of bleeding reserves, watching gold ships sail outward from the Thames toward foreign vaults, the Bank of England finally felt pressure ease. It was temporary, fragile, almost artificial, but it was relief nonetheless. And sometimes, that's enough to buy time. Meanwhile, in Paris, the French leadership understood the deeper implication. This was no longer about metal. This was about trust, or at least the illusion of it. By agreeing to stabilize their currencies together, the three nations had taken an unspoken step away from the gold standard's harsh discipline and into something far more flexible, far more political, far more dangerous. They had acknowledged, without saying it aloud, that money no longer needed to be a fixed truth. It could be managed, guided, even manipulated, so long as the right hands were touching the controls. It was the dawn of a new philosophy, money as a negotiated reality. But even as the pact worked in the short term, its long-term effects were beginning to take shape, quietly, invisibly, inevitably. Because every system built on trust alone has a timer hidden inside it. And in 1936, the countdown had already begun. The real turning point didn't happen in a conference room, or through a signed document, or even in the headlines. It happened in the shadows, in the moment the United States, Britain, and France quietly admitted to themselves that gold could no longer govern the world. And that power was now held by whoever controlled the flow of currency, not the metal behind it. This was the silent birth of a new economic order. As the Tripartite Agreement went into effect, the world didn't notice the shift, but the markets felt it instantly. Gold stopped leaving vaults. Currencies stopped crashing into each other. And for the first time since the Great Depression began, nations weren't fighting over value. They were coordinating it, shaping it, bending it. Behind closed doors, central bankers realized something profound. If three nations could manage currencies together, then money itself could be managed like a global machine. Not through gold, not through fixed rules, but through cooperation, manipulation, and policy. This was the moment when the dollar began its ascent. The moment when France lost its grip. The moment when Britain quietly accepted it could no longer lead alone. And the moment when global finance, for the first time, became political. Once the pact took hold, the market stabilized. But something else happened, something the public never saw. Governments discovered they could control economic reality by controlling the exchange rate wall behind it. This wasn't written in any treaty. It wasn't voted on. It wasn't debated. It simply happened, and the world never went back. This was the quiet turning of the key inside the global financial machine, the mechanism that would later unlock Bretton Woods, the IMF, the World Bank, and eventually our modern era of floating currencies and endless intervention. The Tripartite Agreement didn't just manage chaos. It created a new kind of power. When historians look back, they talk about the Great Depression, about gold, about Roosevelt, about collapsing empires. But they almost never mention this, the soft handshake in 1936 that quietly rewired the world. It was the moment nations learned they could manage currencies like levers. The moment money shifted from something grounded in metal to something grounded in decisions. The moment trust replaced gold and policy replaced certainty. From that point forward, every crisis, every stimulus package, every central bank intervention followed this blueprint. A system born in secrecy, held together by confidence, and vulnerable to the same fragility that gold once protected us from. The Tripartite Agreement didn't last long, but its philosophy outlived it, shaping the financial DNA of the modern world. And today, whenever markets shake, whenever currencies fall, whenever nations negotiate in silence, you're watching echoes of 1936, a forgotten pact, a quiet shift, a new world hidden inside an old one. If you want more deep dive documentaries revealing the hidden mechanics behind money and global power, subscribe. There's a lot more the history books never told.